Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, thank you. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, which is the first in the Institute's new Academic Freedom Lecture Series. Before I introduce our speakers, let me acknowledge Susan Fales-Hill and Aaron Hill, who generously, established a fund for Civil Discourse that is supporting this event. I'd also like to thank members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors whose generosity keeps Radcliffe events and exhibitions free and open to the public. We thank you. Today's program is part of Radcliffe's initiative on academic freedom and connecting across difference, which we launched last fall. This 5-year effort aims to elevate open inquiry and constructive dialogue and to critically engage both the concept of and threats against academic freedom. That is, the freedoms to teach, learn, and conduct research without censorship or retaliation. We also aim to examine the ways in which American institutions of higher education, of course Harvard among them, have at times fallen short of our ideals. Powerful critiques of colleges and universities have emerged from across the political spectrum and from both within and beyond the academy. Yale Law School professor Daniel Markovits, for instance, sees highly selective colleges and universities as perpetuating rather than countering inequality. Meritocratic education, he argues, now predominantly serves an elite caste rather than the general public. Philip Hamburger, a Columbia Law School professor and non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, levels a wide-ranging critique spanning universities' funding structures, as well as what he sees as a troubling dearth of intellectual diversity on campus. He calls for, quote, thorough reconsideration of higher education, not only to fix it, but to reconstitute it. Meanwhile, public trust has also waned. The proportion of Americans expressing confidence in higher education fell from 57% in 2015 to 42% in 2025. And in a recent Pew survey, 7 in 10 Americans said higher education is going in the wrong direction. We're at a crossroads, and the path forward depends upon not only our capacity to guard and uphold our foundational commitments, but also our willingness to engage thoughtfully with good faith criticisms. Today's program will consider one such critique. In his lecture this afternoon, my esteemed colleague, Michael Sandel, will explore whether meritocracy is corrosive of democracy. And in the process, he'll raise difficult questions about inequality, the diploma divide, and the role of higher education in perpetuating political partisanship. After Michael's remarks, he'll join me and 2 of our other esteemed colleagues, David Deming and Randall Kennedy, in conversation. Now, I can't do justice in this brief introduction to Michael's, or indeed any of today's distinguished speakers' scholarly work and impact, so I'll provide only brief highlights of their many accomplishments, and you'll find links to their full biographies on Radcliffe's webpage. Michael Sandel is the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government at Harvard, and his scholarship has informed dialogue within and beyond the academy on some of the most pressing moral and civic questions of our time. His writings on justice, ethics, democracy, meritocracy, and markets have been translated into more than 30 languages, and his many books include The Tyranny of Merit, Can We Find Common Ground, and Democracy's Discontent, a new edition for our perilous times. Michael's legendary course, Justice, was the first Harvard class to be made freely available online and has been viewed by tens of millions of people around the world. His numerous awards and honors include the 2025 Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture and Spain's Princess of Asturias Award for Social Sciences. David Deming is Danoff Dean of Harvard College. An economist, his research focuses on higher education, economic inequality, technology, and the future of the labor market. David holds appointments in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Graduate School of Education, and the Kennedy School of Government, where he serves as the Isabel and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy. David is the author of numerous publications, and his honors include the Sharon Rosen Prize and the David N. Kershaw Prize. Finally, Randall Kennedy is the Michael R. Klein Professor at the Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. Prior to joining Harvard, he served as a law clerk for Judge Skelly Wright of the U.S. Court of Appeals and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the U.S. Supreme Court. Randall is the award-winning author of numerous works for scholarly and popular audiences, and his many books include Say It Loud, on race, history, and culture, and for discrimination, race, affirmative action, and the law. I am so grateful to Michael, David, and Randall for joining us today and for sharing your perspectives and expertise. We also welcome your questions, whether you're joining us in person or online. You can submit your questions using the Slido link that's provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. Also note this program is being recorded and will be posted on Radcliffe's website in about a week if you'd like to refer to it or refer others to it. Now, please join me in warmly welcoming Michael Sandel to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Brown-Nagin, for that introduction and for convening us. And I'm bracing myself for the discussion to follow with the three of you, including David Deming, who just, thanks to all of us, has taken up his role as the new dean of Harvard College. I'm deeply grateful for that. And also my friend Randall Kennedy. We've been friends only for about 50 years, and I still can't predict quite what he's going to say. So I'm in perpetual suspense, including now. My short answer to the question, is meritocracy undermining democracy, is yes. It's also doing harm to higher education. And the reasons are connected. Connected to what I describe as the tyranny of merit. Now, it may seem paradoxical to describe merit as a kind of tyranny. We commonly think of it as a good thing, something we should seek and aspire to. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. That's merit, being well-qualified for the social role. So how can merit become a kind of tyranny? To answer this question, we need, well, to begin by noticing that our civic life isn't going very well. It's beset by polarization and rancor. And as Tomiko pointed out, higher education is not terribly popular these days. The public confidence in higher education has plummeted in recent decades. And it seems to me there's a connection between these two alarming features of our social and political life. We might begin to consider what connects them and how merit can become a kind of tyranny by looking back over the past 5 decades. During this time, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with the widening inequalities of income and wealth during this period, but it has also to do with the changing attitudes towards success that have accompanied the widening inequalities. Those who've landed on top during the age of globalization have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full bounty the market bestows upon them, and by implication, that those who struggle, those left behind, must deserve their fate too. Now, this way of thinking about success arises from a seemingly attractive ideal, the principle of meritocracy, the principle that says, simply put, that insofar as chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Now, of course, chances are not truly equal. We all know that. Children born poor tend to stay poor as adults. For all we console ourselves about mobility being an answer to inequality, it isn't easy to rise. A study was made comparing intergenerational mobility rates among well-off countries. And the question that the survey asked was, at current rates of intergenerational mobility, how many generations would it take for someone born poor to rise, not to the top, but to the median income in their society? There are some countries that have pretty good upward mobility. In Denmark, it takes 2 generations. In the US, what would you guess? 5, yes, 5 generations. So from this, we could conclude that the American dream is alive and well and living in Copenhagen. We see it in the universities. We see it in the universities. We don't live up fully to the meritocratic principles we profess. Despite generous financial aid policies at many of the top, most selective universities, the Ivy League and the like, it remains the fact that there are more students in these places from families in the top 1% than there are students from families in the bottom half of the country combined. Now, you might conclude from this isn't an argument against meritocracy, it's simply an argument that we haven't fully realized a meritocracy. We need to double down on the project of creating genuinely fair equality of opportunity, so that everyone not only starts from the same starting point, but also arrives at that starting point with the same basic access and advantages to compete effectively. But even a perfect meritocracy would be flawed. It would not amount to a just society for the following reason. Meritocracy has a dark side, even a fully realized one. And the dark side is that meritocracy is corrosive of the common good. It leads the winners. It leads to hubris among the winners. Leads them to think, well, to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget their indebtedness to those who made their achievements possible. And it leads to humiliation to those left behind, those less fortunate than themselves. Which brings us to our current political moment. One of the most potent sources of the populist backlash against elites is the sense among many working people that credentialed elites look down on them. And this, it seems to me, is a legitimate complaint. Because even as globalization brought deepening inequality and outsourced jobs and hollowed out industrial communities and stagnant wages, even as all of this was happening, its proponents, and here I'm talking about Democrats and Republicans alike, its proponents offered workers some bracing advice. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, they said, go to college. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. This rhetoric of rising, as I call it, became so familiar that it became a kind of mantra almost. And it seemed almost uncontroversial. Who could object? Even though it had the effect of deflecting responsibility for the widening inequality in those hollowed out communities from the policymakers who enacted those economic arrangements to the individual working people who suffered allegedly because they failed to improve themselves as they had been told to do. In short, the elites who intoned the rhetoric of rising missed the insult implicit in it. The insult was this: if you're struggling in the new economy and you didn't get a college degree, your failure is your fault, not ours. Elites so valorized a college degree, both as an avenue for advancement and as the basis for social esteem, that they have difficulty understanding the hubris a meritocracy can generate and the harsh judgment it imposes on those who haven't gone to college. Those of us who spend our days in the company of the credentialed can easily forget a simple fact. Most of our fellow citizens don't have a four-year college degree. About 62% do not. So it was folly to create an economy that sets as a necessary condition on dignified work and a decent life a four-year degree that most people don't have. So what should we do? If meritocratic attitudes toward success have deepened the divide between winners and losers, if individual mobility through higher education is too feeble a response to the inequalities of income and wealth that now prevail, if the rhetoric of rising has become, for many, less a promise than a taunt, what should we do? What is the alternative? Well, we should begin by acknowledging that mobility cannot compensate for inequality. Any serious response to the gap between the rich and the rest must reckon directly with inequalities of power and wealth rather than rest content with the project of helping people scramble up a ladder even as the rungs on the ladder grow further and further apart. This means shifting the terms of public discourse, focusing less on arming people for meritocratic competition, and focusing more on affirming the dignity of work. We should ask what policies would ensure that Americans who do not inhabit the privileged ranks of the professional credentialed classes, to ensure that they can find work that enables them to support a family, to contribute to their community, and, most important of all, to win social recognition and esteem for doing so. Now, part of the solution, that's broadly speaking a suggestion that we change the terms of public discourse. But part of the solution also requires rethinking the role of higher education. Colleges and universities now preside over the system that we have become the arbiters of opportunity in a market-driven meritocratic society. Colleges and universities confer the credentials and define the merits that determine who lands where. This is the role into which we have, in a way, been conscripted during the age of meritocratic inequality. And in some ways, making us, those of us in higher education, the animating heart of meritocratic aspiration, confers on higher education an enormous cultural authority and prestige. It's made admission to elite colleges the object of fevered ambition. It's enabled many American universities to amass enormous endowments. But converting these institutions into the bulwark of a meritocratic order may not be good for democracy or for the students who compete to attend, or even for the colleges and universities themselves. Here's why. Notwithstanding our role as the arbiter of opportunity and the engine of upward mobility, higher education has not provided a significant counterweight to the rising inequality of recent times. Most students at selective colleges and universities are from affluent families. Very few from low-income backgrounds. More than 70% of those who attend the 100 or so most competitive colleges in the United States come from the top quarter of the income scale. What proportion come from the bottom quarter? About 3%. If you come from a rich family, the top 1%, your chances of attending an Ivy League school are 77 times greater than if you come from a poor family, bottom 20%. And most young people from the bottom half of the income scale attend a two-year college or none at all. Now, an economist colleague, Raj Chetty, who's a close colleague also of Professor Deming, recently did a study of 1,800 colleges and universities in the United States to see just how potent an engine of upward mobility higher education is. These included public and private, selective and not selective colleges and universities. And they asked what percentage of students in these places arrive poor from low-income families and rise as adults to upper income, top 20%. The answer? 2%. 2%. So it's a mistake to think, as we often assume, that higher education is a powerful engine of upward mobility. Now, this isn't because attending college or university doesn't help one get a good job and make a good living. The reason it's only 2% is that there are so few students in these places from low-income families to begin with. Higher education is like an elevator, but it's like an elevator in a building that most people enter on the top floor. Now, there's another. So I've spoken and we're familiar with the way in which, the extent to which higher education reinforces inequalities and patterns of privilege rather than offers a significant challenge to them. But there's another reason to resist our role as sorting machines, which is what we've become, sorting machines for a market-driven meritocratic society. And that has to do not with the unfairness to those who lose out, but to the damage this role, this system inflicts on the winners, on those who get in. Prosperous parents have figured out how to give their kids a powerful boost in the competition for admission, and that's why there is the persisting inequality and pattern of privilege. But the cost of affluent parents passing their privilege on to their kids, the cost is in transforming the high school years, and sometimes even the earlier years, into high-stress, anxiety-ridden, sleep-deprived passage, a tournament of AP courses, test prep tutoring, sports training, dance and music lessons, internships to do good works in distant places, and a myriad of extracurricular and public service activities, often under the advice and tutelage of private admissions consultants, whose fees can sometimes cost even more than the 4 years in tuition. Now, this is a problem for two reasons. For those who lack the apparatus of advantage, it's unfair. For the young people entangled in the apparatus, it's oppressive. The meritocratic struggle gives rise to a culture of invasive, achievement-driven, pushy parenting that does not serve young people well. In fact, the use of the word parent as a verb only became common in the 1970s. Before that, it was just a noun. When the need, as it is now, the need to prepare children for academic success came to be seen as a pressing parental responsibility. And this has taken a harsh toll on the emotional well-being and on the mental health of young people in this category, and we've seen much writing and discussion of this. Not only that, it changes young people's attitudes toward their own education even when they arrive. The instinct for sorting and competing invades college life, where students come to reenact the ritual of accepting and rejecting. Here's an example close to home. Harvard College has more than 400 extracurricular clubs and organizations. Now, some, like the orchestra and the varsity football team, do require certain abilities, and so they legitimately hold tryouts. But today, comping, you know what comping is? Comping, competing for admission to student organizations, whether or not those organizations demand special skills, this is commonplace. It's rife. The student, like the colleges themselves, and this is what's interesting, the student organizations boast about their low acceptance rates. The Harvard College Consulting Group declares itself, quote, the most selective pre-professional student group on Harvard's campus with an acceptance rate below 12%. The Crimson Key Society, they organize Freshman Orientation Week, and they run campus tours. They also advertise their selectivity. Only 11.5% of applicants are accepted. They were asked about this, and the director said, we don't want to put just anyone in front of tourists. I'm a little dubious about this explanation. The need for talent seems less compelling than the impulse to reenact the trauma and the rush of meritocratic competition. The habit of hoop jumping is hard to break. But it's damaging to the purpose and mission of a liberal arts education. it distorts education, higher education, into basic training for a competitive meritocracy, into an education in packaging oneself and applying for stuff. And this reflects a broader shift in the role of colleges and universities. Our credentializing function, our sorting function now looms so large that it overwhelms our educational function. The sorting and the striving begin sooner or later to crowd out teaching and learning. And I worry about that. And I see it in my students. And so here is a reason beyond the question of fairness, beyond the angry populist backlash against elites looking down, a reason to reconsider our having been conscripted, by our I mean higher education, into this role. Now, I have a number of proposals, and perhaps we can discuss more in the discussion which is about to follow, about what to do about this. But here's one modest proposal for a start. In my book, The Tyranny of Merit, I suggest that highly competitive places with lots of applicants change their admission policy. Harvard and Stanford, for example, get roughly 50,000 applicants a year for about 2,000 places. And the admissions officers tell us that a great many of the 50,000 are well qualified to do the work and to do it well and to flourish and to contribute to the education of their classmates. So my proposal is for a lottery of the qualified. Let the admissions office cull out those who are not well qualified. And among the rest, whether it be 20,000 or 30,000 or 12,000, whatever the number turns out to be, with a strong threshold of qualification, among those, do a lottery. And the reason for doing the lottery, well, first of all, it's absurd to think that it's possible really to assess at age 19 the future promise, except maybe in math, the future promise of a young person from among a great many well-qualified ones. I mean, Nolan Ryan, take baseball, one of the greatest pitchers in the history of baseball, first-round Hall of Famer. When he was 18 years old, he wasn't signed in the Major League draft until the 12th round. That means teams chose 294 other seemingly more promising players before he was chosen. Tom Brady, who was the greatest quarterback in NFL history, he was the 199th draft pick. Now, it's so circumscribed a talent as the ability to throw a baseball or a football is hard to predict with much certainty at age 18 or 19. It's folly to think that the ability to have a broad and significant impact on society or some field of endeavor or of scholarship can be predicted well enough to justify fine-grained rankings of promising high school seniors. But there's a more compelling reason for the lottery, which is to relieve, at least to some extent, the soul-killing, resume-stuffing, perfection-seeking experience that the high school years have become. And it might also deflate, to some extent, meritocratic hubris by making clear what is true in any case, that those who land on top don't make it on their own, but owe their good fortune to family circumstance and native gifts and all sorts of contingencies morally akin to the luck of the draw. Now, I made this proposal. The book came out in 2020, and I didn't have many takers. And I was discouraged. But then, a few years later, I read a blog posting by a distinguished economist whom I very much admired, who made a similar proposal. I found that encouraging. And then, 2 years after I read that blog post, in 2023, that economist was named Dean of Harvard College, David Deming. So this gives me hope, which we can all explore in the discussion to follow. But the lottery would not be enough. We need to do a number of other broader things in our social life. We need to dismantle the steep hierarchy of esteem that accords greater honor and prestige to students enrolled in name-brand colleges and universities than to those in community colleges or in technical and vocational training programs. We need to increase our quite paltry public investment in those technical and vocational training programs. Learning to become a plumber or an electrician or a dental hygienist should be respected as a valuable contribution to the common good, not regarded as a consolation prize for those who lack the SAT scores or financial means to make it to the Ivy League. Finally, higher education derives much of its prestige from its avowedly higher purpose, not only to equip students for the world of work, but also to prepare them to be morally reflective human beings and effective democratic citizens. Now, I don't think we're doing very well at that job right now. But even if we could do better, why should we assume that colleges and universities must have a monopoly on this mission? A more capacious notion of educating citizens for democracy would resist what we've done, which is to sequester civic education in universities and then hold a tournament to see who can win admission to the Citadel, where civic education and moral education are made possible. There's no reason why four-year colleges should be the sole setting for courses in moral reasoning and civic argument. Civic education out of doors, a broadly diffused civic education, has a long tradition. Here's one example. In the late 19th century, the Knights of Labor, one of America's first major labor unions, demanded, along with better pay and better working hours, they demanded reading rooms in factories so that workers could inform themselves about public affairs and be effective citizens. This demand grew out of a civic tradition that viewed civic learning as embedded, at least in part, in the world of work. So this is connected. This way of thinking about education is connected to the dignity of work. It depends on the idea that civic education can flourish, should flourish, not only within elite colleges and universities, but also in community colleges, job training sites, and union halls. There's no reason to suppose that aspiring nurses and plumbers are less suited to the art of democratic government than aspiring management consultants. Now, some of you may think that to speak of the tyranny of merit in this way is to give up on the project of equality of opportunity. Not at all. Equality of opportunity is an important principle. No one should be held back by poverty or prejudice. But it's important to remember that equality of opportunity is a remedial principle. It's not an adequate ideal for a good society. What more do we need? A broader democratic equality of condition, by which I don't mean a state of affairs where everyone has to have the same income and wealth, but a broad equality of condition that enables those who don't achieve great wealth or prestigious positions to live lives of decency and dignity, developing and exercising their abilities in work that wins social esteem, sharing in a widely diffused culture of learning, and deliberating with their fellow citizens about public affairs. The American dream was not always only or mainly about individual mobility through higher education. The term was coined in 1931 by a man called James Truslow Adams. And he had in mind something like what I've called the broad democratic equality of condition. He gave an example. The US Library of Congress, here's how he put it, is one looks down on the general reading room. One sees the seats filled with silent readers, old and young, rich and poor, black and white, the executive and the laborer, the general and the private, the noted scholar and the schoolboy, all reading at their own library provided by their own democracy. Adams considered this scene to be the perfect working out in a concrete example of the American dream. And if this example could be carried out throughout our national life, he said, the American dream would become an abiding reality. We do not have much democratic equality of condition these days. One of the most corrosive effects of the inequality of the last 5 decades is that those who are affluent and those of modest means increasingly live separate lives. We live and work and shop and play in separate places. We send our kids to different schools. This isn't good for democracy, because democracy doesn't require a perfect equality, but it does require that people from different backgrounds, different walks of life, encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of their everyday lives. Because this is how we learn to negotiate and to abide our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. So the alternative to the tyranny of merit is not to go back to aristocracy or nepotism or favoritism. The alternative to meritocracy and to the meritocratic inequality with which we live today is to build and to nurture the public spaces and common places that bring people together from different backgrounds and walks of life. Only in this way can we invigorate our democracy, begin to ease the rancor and polarization that sets us apart, and find our way, perhaps, to a less rancorous, more generous public life. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Thank you.
So I'm going to sit in the first chair.
Okay.
Good. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for exploring your many ideas with us, and we're going to try to unpack those in a set of questions that I have, and also there are many questions coming from the audience. Thank you so much for your contributions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. But I'd like to begin the conversation by drawing out the different perspectives that David and Randy bring to the ideas that you have shared with us, Michael, here today. Why don't you, first we'll start with David and then turn to Randy, offer some initial reactions to Michael's thoughts, and then we'll have a more detailed conversation.
Happy to do that. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. It is true, I did write this blog post that Michael mentions. I guess I do the opposite of disavow it, I avow it. So I did write that I think it would be healthy for the culture around elite college admissions to have some kind of transparent admissions process, a lottery of the qualified, something like what Michael said. So, I wrote that before I became Dean of Harvard College, but I stand by the principle of it, and I think that it's especially important, the cultural impacts that he brings up, which is that the truth is that once you get down to a list of people who are all incredibly qualified to attend a place like this, you are throwing darts at a board at some level, whether you realize it or not. And so rather than having this corrosive idea that somebody peered deeply into the soul of a 17-year-old and figured out whether they're worthy, that you would transparently know that some people got lucky and some didn't, and that's sort of the reality of our lives anyway, and I support that. I think that's the right sentiment. The main thing I want to say about that is that I think it's a little bit of the way I would say this is it's a little bit of a bait and switch about the argument of whether meritocracy undermines democracy, because the other piece of that post, which you did not quote, was about the quantitative impacts of what something like this would do for inequality in any real sense. So just to put some numbers to it, the Ivy Plus universities, meaning the Ivy League plus Stanford, Duke, the University of Chicago, and MIT, so 12 of the most selective universities in the country, collectively enroll 0.9% of all students. Okay. So if all of those colleges tripled the share of low-income students that attended, or quadrupled it, or did a lottery of the qualified, the truth is that it wouldn't actually make a dent in any of the rising inequality that Professor Sandel mentions. So it may have cultural significance, but the real answer to me for rising inequality in America and how it's corroded our democracy, if it has, doesn't have to do with what happens on elite college campuses. It's kind of fun to talk about the culture of comping, and I deplore it as much as the next person. I've spent a lot of time in Annenberg talking to first-year students about this. It's one of these things, like meritocracy, that Professor Sandel talks about, that everybody kind of deplores but doesn't really know how to fix because it's a difficult collective action problem. I think I'd like for us to be healthier about that, but I don't actually think that's the fundamental source of inequality in this country, and I think it's a bit of a misattribution. The way I would put it, as somebody who attended a state school, Harvard is the first private school I ever attended. I went to the Ohio State University, go Bucks. And the distinguishing feature of being at a place like that for me was that it is a great university for people who know who are equipped, either by virtue of their family background or by virtue of their personal qualities or whatever it is, to take advantage of the opportunities in front of them. But it is also a place where you can get lost and nobody knows it. And so I had a lot of friends, either in high school or in college, who were very talented people, but who were just not ready at the ripe old age of 18 to take advantage of the opportunities in front of them, who missed class, who got distracted by parties or whatever else it was, and nobody knew that they fell through the cracks. And what a place like this buys you is a safety net. That's not the only thing it does, but it's a floor underneath you. And to me, the fundamental source of inequality is that so many young people who have talent but are not ready to take full advantage of those talents are not able to achieve their potential because they do not have the resources devoted to them that a place like Harvard or other universities provide. And the answer to me, paradoxically, is that actually you might want to invest more in higher education, not to think about higher education as the engine. I don't actually think it's correct to say that higher education undermines meritocracy. I would say it's the opposite, that the lack of access to high-quality higher education perpetuates some of the issues that Professor Sandel discusses and certainly perpetuates inequality. So my solution would look much less like talking in sort of negatively about what happens on elite college campuses, and much more about pre-distribution, people sometimes call it, which is to make sure that as many people as possible at the age of 18 are qualified to attend good universities, and on the supply side, making sure that public universities are adequately funded and that they are in a place where they can take on more students, because actually the college wage premium, meaning the difference between what you earn if you have a college degree and what you don't, is determined, it's not some law of nature, it's actually a function of how scarce the degree is. And so if 70% of the American public had a college degree rather than 40%, the college wage premium would be lower. And the difference in wages between people who had a degree and those who don't would be smaller because the degree isn't as scarce. And so actually what you want is more college, not less. And what you need is to provide it to more people. So my narrative about what has happened in America over the past 40 to 50 years is that we went from a society where only about 10 to 20% of people really needed to have a college degree. That is, they needed to have the kind of exposure to an education to prepare you for information-intensive knowledge work, the kinds of things, learning critical thinking and conversations across difference and all the things we do here. That was not necessary in very many jobs in 1940, but it's necessary in many jobs today. And so we've gone from a world where probably only 1 in 10 or 1 in 8 people need to go to college to a world where almost everyone does. And yet we don't spend enough money as a society on providing the resources to make that possible. And so those resources are distributed highly unevenly. Yes, that's true, they're distributed at elite colleges like this, but actually it's these colleges that do more for talented low-income students than many others. So many of you may not know this, but actually the class of 2029, we just announced it yesterday, I think, half of the class of 2029 is paying no tuition. Okay, so half of the class, that means, and anybody who is admitted to Harvard who makes less than, their family earns less than $200,000 a year, attends without paying tuition. And that's because Harvard, unlike most universities in the country, is fortunate enough to be able to provide financial aid. We provide financial aid to something like 70% of the class. Okay, and so most schools don't have the resources to do that, and most states have increased tuition at public universities much faster than the cost of inflation, not because they're trying to create inequality, but rather because they don't have the resources to make tuition low enough to allow people to attend, or to give scholarships to people based on need. And financial aid hasn't kept pace. So to me, the story is much more about what's happening in broader society. And it's also, I'll just conclude by saying, it's also much more about the post-tax and transfer system, so the post-tax system. So it's interesting to me that we think about American universities as a kind of paragon of meritocracy, but because if you know anything about how European universities, for example, select students, you know that it's a relatively ruthless competition where people who have the highest test scores get sorted deterministically to the most selective universities that have the most resources, and that sorting often happens at a relatively early age. But we don't think about that as creating tons of inequality. Why? Because countries like Denmark have top marginal tax rates that are 75% or above. They have collective wage bargaining to make sure that wages are much more compressed relative to the US. And so they have a whole system of social spending and a safety net that compresses inequality relative to the distribution of educational resources. And that is the reason why those countries don't look like this one, not so much because of differences in access to elite education. So my diagnosis of the problem, I agree it's a problem. I would actually say in some ways that democracy is undermining democracy, because we've had things like the tax revolt across states where state governments basically said, okay, we have to balance our budgets every year, we're not gonna fully fund state universities, we're not gonna spend the resources required to invest in people broadly and education broadly. And so I think the problems Professor Sandel identifies are real problems, but I think the diagnosis is a bit misattributed. Thank you.
Thank you. And Randy.
Well, thank you very much. I agree with much of what Professor Sandel says. I especially agree with his plea for more provision for the uncolleged working class. And when I say provision, I mean material provision, as well as the provision of status goods, respect. I also agree with him about meritocratic hubris, the arrogance of the winners, the belief that they did it all on their own and that they therefore deserve their good fortune. So I agree with all of that. But, and let me try to get at the but by bringing in two features of your talk and of your wonderful book. You're a sportsman. You love sports. The conclusion of your book begins with an anecdote involving Hank Aaron, I believe. Yeah. And in your talk, you mentioned Tom Brady, but then you went to your first love, Nolan Ryan, baseball. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that, and you also mentioned the idea of a tournament. And I want to get into that a little bit through my favorite sport. My favorite sport is tennis, and I'm going to use a person, Coco Gauff. Now, I want Coco Gauff to know that luck had a lot to do with her superiority as a tennis professional. She is blessed with a wonderful physique. She had parents who were able to support her and teach her. She has had a community that has been supportive. All of those were really a matter of luck. She didn't create that. She was lucky enough to benefit from it. Here's where, so we're in accord there. Here's my question to you, and here's with the tournament. I don't want her to be big-headed. I don't want the stars to be big-headed and suffer from meritocratic hubris. I do want to keep the tournament, however. And when you think about a tournament, the United States Open, 2 weeks. Every day, there's somebody who wins and there's somebody who loses. And at the end of that 2 weeks, there's going to be one person who holds up the trophy. And that person is going to feel a tremendous sense of exaltation. They are going to feel they won the tournament. There are going to be 2 weeks of people who lose. Now, we could do it differently. You could have a couple of rounds, first round, second round, third round, and then we stop the tournament. At the round of 16, maybe you stop the tournament at the quarterfinals, maybe you stop the tournament at the semifinals. You could do that. Now, I don't want that. I want it played out. I want to see the champion. Now, Professor Sandel derides, quote, the meritocratic tournament that college admissions has become. And he would replace, as you heard, the tournament with a lottery of the qualified. Note that he is not a thoroughgoing egalitarian. He's not a thoroughgoing egalitarian. He eschews what he calls in his book, quote, a sterile, oppressive equality of results. He eschews that. He doesn't want a total lottery. He wants a lottery of the well-qualified. Now, of course, in a way, he wants a kinder, gentler regime, but that kinder, gentler regime will still produce losers. They will still produce people who don't get in, and there are these other people who got in. I'm worried about meritocratic hubris, and I applaud you for criticizing it, but I'm also worried about something else that you don't talk about, as far as I'm concerned, don't talk about enough. And that is the aggressive, anti-meritocratic envy and resentment and proud ignorance of the sort that is so currently threatening to our enterprise. The subtext of some of your remarks was that we have brought it on ourselves and deserve to be brought low. I don't think so. I think at this moment we face the perennial adversaries of excellence, and we need to be willing to protect legitimate meritocracy. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And those were terrific comments, Michael. Can you take a few minutes to respond?
I'll try. On the culture of comping, Dean Deming doesn't like it, as I don't. Why not establish a presumption? Need not be a hard and fast once and for all rule, but a presumption that once you get into Harvard College, you can participate in any student club or organization without having to compete, except in those handful of cases where they can make a legitimate claim for it.
Okay, so these are largely student organizations that operate on their own. So this is student-on-student activities. So what you're asking me to do is intervene in the lives of students and tell them on which activities they're permitted to compete and on which they're not. No, and just want to make sure. I don't think I should be doing that.
Okay.
And I don't intend to do it. And the reason is because these students are adults, and while I may deplore the culture of comping, I would rather try to persuade them that it's not in their interests, rather than be the policeman and tell them that they can't do it.
All right,
and I think that's actually, in some ways, consistent with a healthier culture that you are trying to describe, which is that we want to teach our students that they need to win a war of ideas and persuasion and not tell them what they must and must not do as part of an educational mission. So that'd be my answer.
Right. Would you go so far as to try to talk them out of it?
I already have, yes.
Okay, all right.
But that's very different. That's very different than using my powers as dean to try to tell them what they can and can't do. Which
all right. Well, I
won't
wish you well in that effort of persuasion. But I do, and just while I'm on David's points, of course it's true that the lottery for admissions or tamping down the culture of comping, even if successful in making for a more wholesome high school and college experience, would not solve the broader social and political problems. But the reason I mention the culture of comping is not only as a local idiosyncrasy, but it's characteristic of a broader way of thinking about access, where we define quality or excellence through a cult of selectivity. And this occurred to me when I was listening to the radio the other night, driving home, and heard an ad for a company called California Psychics. They provide psychics for those who need one or want one. And they were explaining how they provide the best psychics. And they said, and I checked their website, and the headline on the website of California Psychics is, "We reject 98% of the psychics who apply." Only the top 20% make the cut. And that's why you can trust us to bring the joy of certainty to you. I never thought that psychics trafficked in certainty, but so I thought that was curious. And then I thought back to another example that struck me when I was teaching a course on bioethics and eugenics and so on. Commercial sperm banks. The most successful commercial sperm bank locates its offices, its collection centers, if you can call them that, in Palo Alto near Stanford, and in Cambridge, halfway between Harvard and MIT, and they play up the prestigious source of the donor sperm that they sell. And in their online ad, they say, "We actively recruit donors from top US universities." And one of the requirements is currently attending or have graduated from college. So if you're in that 62%, don't try to sell your sperm to this sperm bank. But they add that they have such high standards that only 1% of the applicants are accepted into their sperm donor program which enables them, and listen to this rhetoric, to maintain our standards of excellence so that we can offer our members the best of all times, meritocratic sperm. Now, these may seem eccentric extensions, but it's connected. What it suggests is that the cult of selectivity as a way of defining excellence or merit or equality is not restricted to the comping culture, that it's a broader cultural phenomenon that's worth noticing and maybe attending to. Then, as to Randy's point, a tournament, I don't think that they should stop the tennis match or the Major League Baseball playoffs after the first round or the second. I agree with you about that. And you're right that if you play it till the end, there will be winners and there will be losers. But the difference with the winners and losers in a sports tournament is that in one tournament, Alcaraz will prevail, and in another, Sinner will prevail in the world of tennis. And part of what draws us to the next tournament is to see who will wind up on top and who not. But when we're talking about winners and losers that have resulted from the past 5 decades of inequality, abetted by and rationalized, the inequality I mean, by meritocratic ways of justifying who lands on top, that has a way of more or less freezing in place who's a winner and who's a loser. So if we want the tournament analogy, we would have to imagine a system of valuation and of judgment and patterns of advancement that were heavily skewed in favor of once a winner, always a winner. That would wreck sports, not only a society and a democracy.
There's a debate about that. And I actually want to turn to Randy again to talk about, who's a scholar of racial inequality, to bring race into this conversation. I wonder how you think questions about racial inequality and the push to level the playing field in education intersect with the kinds of arguments that Michael is making about meritocratic sorting, generating resentment, and being corrosive to democracy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're invoking the affirmative action debate. And one of the most, a feature in American history and American life has to do with the way in which merit stinks so much in the nostrils of people from groups that have been disadvantaged. So, from my comments, you can see I'm deeply drawn to meritocracy. I mean, I'm
real meritocracy, fair.
Just merit. I'm a competitive sort.
Yeah.
Was a competitive tennis player, and I am drawn to it. But I also know that until very recently, it did not matter how brilliant a scholar was. If that scholar was black, need not apply, including to Harvard University.
Absolutely.
Harvard University had its first black tenured member of the faculty in 1950, who never taught here. It was Ralph Bunche. It was the year he won the Nobel Prize. but didn't teach here. And one could go on and on and on. And this has really made the idea of meritocracy stink. What's so striking, actually, is the extent to which people who have been marginalized, I would say racial minorities, I'd also say women, the extent to which people who've been marginalized so terribly and until so recently have actually still have such faith in meritocracy.
Right.
So this issue of meritocracy, and I'll just say one more last thing.
Sure.
Right now, we have a federal government that says that it is all in favor of meritocracy. And one of the reasons why it's attacking Harvard University is because, in its view, it's not sufficiently committed to meritocracy. Take a look at the cabinet of the United States of America.
Thank you so much for.
Can I also just
add
to that, Professor Kennedy, that you may not know this, but Harvard College students won 8 Rhodes Scholarships last year, which is twice as many as the next highest college. And we had 13 medalists, Olympic medalists at the Paris Games. And our students were in the top 3 of the Putnam International Math Competitions 10 years in a row. So not only are our students excellent and meritocratic, they're more excellent and meritocratic than ever. That's a public service announcement.
Very good. We have so many questions coming in, and so I want to make sure that we get to a few audience questions, including questions from students. The first goes to my introductory comments about declining public trust in higher education. There's a question about whether universities should lean into alternative media outlets and ecosystems like podcasts and social media in order to push back against some of the unfair criticisms of higher education, or even the fair criticisms of higher education. And the student's point is that the mainstream media seems to thrive on undermining higher education. And the student is asking if you, Michael, you, Randy, and David need to be a part of that alternative media environment where so much conversation is happening that is detrimental to us.
I'm waiting for my invitation from Joe Rogan anytime. I'm ready to go.
I think the student makes an excellent point. My view, people were talking about the declining public trust. It's completely understandable since there has been a concerted campaign to vilify the universities and to undercut the public's trust. So that to the extent that there is less public trust, it's not surprising that has been attempted, and very effectively so. And to counteract that, yes, I think that people in higher education, particularly the people who are the leaders of higher education, need to get out more and spread the gospel.
I see it a little bit differently. Of course, I think that leaders of colleges and universities should be effective public spokespeople for their mission and the achievements of their colleges and universities. But I do think that, well, higher education now, including Harvard, is under attack from this administration. And that gives rise to a challenge for the leaders of these institutions, which is, on the one hand, to stand up to the attack, to resist it, and to insist on all the resources at our command to protect the autonomy and the independence that higher education needs to flourish, on the one hand, and at the same time, not to neglect or ignore that some of the criticisms, and here I'm not referring to the attacks by the Trump administration, but some of the American public's loss of confidence in higher education is not just the result of Donald Trump and MAGA politics. Some of it we have brought upon ourselves. And here I may differ from well, what Randy was just saying. Others can speak for themselves. But I think that in order to preserve and to be worthy of public trust, higher education needs to show that we are not just sorting machines that equip young people who are lucky enough or privileged enough or gifted enough to win admission to get good jobs and good careers. That's not enough for us to vindicate our public purpose. We have to show that in addition to launching our students on successful careers, we are institutions who serve the public good. And I think we've strayed from that mission. And to that extent, I think we have made ourselves vulnerable to the kinds of indefensible attacks launched by the Trump administration. We have opened ourselves to those attacks because public confidence has eroded, in part because we are no longer seen, to some extent rightly, as promoting the public good. And I don't just mean by doing biomedical research. That's important, an important contribution to the public good, but I mean in equipping our students, but beyond our students, young people to engage in effective democratic deliberation, argument, reasoning together as democratic citizens. I think we can and should do more to show that our mission is not to promote private privilege, but to contribute to the public good.
Thank you for that. I want to have you respond, Michael, in particular, to a student's question. The student comes from a low-income country and is interested to hear how your view of meritocracy translates to contexts in which there is a lot of corruption and poverty, widespread both, and meritocratic systems have been seen as critical to social transformation and development.
Right.
What do you have to say to that student?
Yeah, and I encounter this question often when I travel to countries, especially developed, but not only developing countries, where meritocracy seems a breath of fresh air compared to systems of nepotism and cronyism and favoritism and patronage and corruption. Isn't meritocracy a liberating alternative to those ways of allocating jobs and opportunities and income and wealth? Yes, it does represent an improvement over those forms of corruption, but up to a point. And it's like the argument that some make who say, well, if meritocracy entrenches privilege, isn't it still better than an aristocracy, a hereditary aristocracy? It's analogous to that rejoinder, to which I would say yes, but the real alternative to meritocracy, the best alternative, is obviously not a caste system or aristocratic hierarchy, hereditary hierarchy. The real alternative to meritocracy is democracy. That's what I would say to the young people from countries struggling with cronyism and corruption, and to those who say, is aristocracy the only alternative? No, I certainly hope not.
Right. Although democracy can produce its own set of problems, as David suggested. I want to, we're running out of time, and I want to give each of you the opportunity to answer this question. And it's a question about what our objectives should be, the ideal role of higher education. What should we be trying to achieve? And for whom should college be for? Who should we invite onto our campus? And I ask this question because it's hard to effectively talk about education reform without first clarifying what our objectives are. So let me start with David, then go to Randy, and we'll end with you, Michael.
Well, okay, I'll answer that question. I kind of wanted to respond to what Professor Sandel said earlier, but I'll answer this question instead. I think actually the course of this conversation has convinced me to believe a little bit more in meritocracy than I did before, and I think I feel about it the way Winston Churchill felt about democracy, which it is the worst form of assignment of spoils in society except for all the others. And I'm not convinced that there's a better way to allocate scarce resources for society as long as the meritocracy is fair and open to all, pursuant to some of Professor Kennedy's comments. Of course, we want it to truly be a meritocracy and not a meritocracy in disguise. And the way I would put it is that meritocracy does create inequality, and inequality is a big problem, and it's an especially big problem in education, but it is also a problem of plenty. And I taught a class for many years before I became dean about economic inequality. And I always started off teaching the class from a historical perspective, and that's because 99.9% of human civilization is a struggle for survival. And the thing that really allowed us to escape the struggle for survival and subsistence farming and the Malthusian trap, where every time population increased, the pie was fixed, and so therefore there were fewer resources to go around and people starved, and then when there were fewer people around, they could exist again. The only thing that allows us to escape that trap is progress, is new technologies, new inventions that allow us to do more with less, to redeploy resources in creative ways, to, for example, go from farming using draft animals to farming using steam power and electricity, and enabling us to be much more capital intensive and machine intensive with farming, which means now only 2% of the US economy has to work in farming instead of essentially 80%, which frees people up to do all sorts of things. And you can think about that as a system of meritocracy, because the spoils in those cases to new inventions go to the people who create them, and that is a capitalist, meritocratic, inequality-generating process. And it generates all sorts of bad things, which Professor Sandel has pointed out, and which I largely agree with. Those are problems that need to be solved. But that doesn't mean the solution is to get rid of meritocracy altogether, but rather to make sure it's fair and to make sure that it's not a caste system, that it actually is accessible to more people. I would love to have, my alternative is in a loose way, some system that is kind of like socialism for children and capitalism for adults. So I would like to see that resources are provided fairly to children in a way that allows them to achieve their potential. And we all recognize that some people have the capacity to do great things, win tennis tournaments, invent vaccines that cure terrible disease, start companies that create jobs, and we want to allow that kind of meritocracy to flourish. We just want to make sure that anybody who has that kind of talent can achieve their potential. That's my vision for a meritocracy that actually works for people, and I think higher education has a lot to do with that. If you look at a place that has this characteristic of talented people, being around each other, admitted to an institution without regard to need, but diverse in all kinds of beautiful ways, working together to learn how to operate in society, it looks an awful lot like Harvard University. And so even though I'm the dean, and so you might expect me to do so, I would defend this institution as actually essential to democracy, despite all its warts.
Thank you. Randy.
One thing first, we have lots of institutions of higher education in the United States, and they serve different missions. And we're here at a big private research university, but we ought not forget that there are other institutions that serve a wide variety of other needs and other very essential needs. Now, for us, if the question is, what do I think that this university should be doing? I think that this university, the three things that are absolutely essential, the protection of the knowledge that has been so hard won over the millennia, the expansion of knowledge, hence research, and then third, the dissemination of knowledge. Those are the three things that, at the end of the day, Harvard University should be dedicated to. The third thing I'd like to say is I'd like to underline again the importance of Professor Sandel's plea to us to be more attentive to the uncolleged working class. And I agree with him that our inattentiveness has come back to harm us. I'm still not quite satisfied, however, with your response to my challenge about the problem of envy, the problem of resentment. I think that we definitely need to be attentive to the arrogance of the winners, but we also have to be attentive to the envy and resentment of people who perceive themselves to be on the losing end of the street, of the stick, even in a society that has a high floor and that attempts to provide people with, a decent mode of living and respect. Even under those circumstances, there are going to be some people who are going to be resentful of those who they see as above them, and we need to figure out some way to cool that out, because that is a very corrosive sentiment.
Thank you. And Michael, in 2 minutes, can you respond?
What is higher education for? To promote the public good, but to do so through teaching and learning. Teaching and learning what? Well, equipping students with skills, the opportunity to develop their talents and capacities, but not only that, that's the technocratic part of teaching and learning. But beyond developing their talents and capacities, providing a soul craft, a moral and civic education that will inspire students to deploy those cultivated talents and skills for the common good. That's what connects what we do, the way we teach our students, and the way we contribute to the public good. And I worry that the technocratic side of what we provide our students has come to swamp in emphasis and proportion the soul craft, the moral and civic education, the cultivation of character, the cultivation of the capacity for judgment, for deliberation as citizens of our students. So that, I think, is how higher education has a distinctive mission in promoting the public good through the way we enroll and teach the students we admit. And if I could just say a little bit in reply to Randy's last point, I don't think that the grievances abroad in the land that have fueled the populist backlash against elites and against universities, I don't think they are mainly about envy. That's not how I understand them. They are certainly entangled with some very ugly sentiments, including racism and misogyny and xenophobia, but I don't think they are only or essentially about those ugly sentiments. I think that what has made this backlash potent is that it has tapped into legitimate grievances having to do not only with economic inequality, but also with the inequalities of social recognition, of honor, of dignity, of respect and esteem that have accompanied the economic inequalities. And those inequalities of social recognition and esteem arise from what I take to be the tyranny of merit. Another way of putting it is, neoliberal economic policies, call them what you will, created the gap between rich and poor. Meritocratic ways of rationalizing those inequalities created the divide between winners and losers, and it's that divide we need to attend to above all.
Very good. Well, thank you so much to Michael, Randy, and David. It's a very wonderfully thought-provoking conversation. And thank you all for being here and for your questions. I hope to see you again soon, and I hope you have a very good night. Thank you.